Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast, an exploration of the blurry line separating our physical world from our abstract realities. Conversations and stories, myths and reality, science and the gods we worship, the esoteric and the everyday. Come explore with me. Okay. Hi, Dean. Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast. It's great to have you here.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm okay. It's 2:30 where I am, which is the sleepy time of the day.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I'm trying to generate some energy as we speak.
Okay, great. I came across your work on Twitter. I think that's just where I originally saw you and maybe some comments that you had made or posts or something. And then I went and actually listened to your podcast, several episodes. Mm-hmm. And it was in listening to those and the conversations that you had with some of your guests that I decided, hey, I'd like to reach out to you and have a conversation with you. I found your podcast interesting because of the kind of the free-flowing conversational style. But also the subject matter is very interesting to me. I like to dive into psychology and also, I don't know what you might call personal growth or healing or whatever you want to call it. But I just appreciate kind of the informed style that you have, but also the nuance that came along with it. So yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me.
Sure.
In listening to your podcast, I find it interesting the way that you like to get the conversation rolling is you usually ask your guests about their experience with Twitter or X and how things are going on there. So I think that would be interesting to actually turn that around on you and just hear your response to that. Like, what's the deal with social media? What's your relationship like with social media? What are the benefits what's going on with you and X?
Well, it's interesting. I've been a little less active lately, but like the last month or so, but that's not a permanent thing. I created my Twitter account in 2009, but I didn't really get active until about 2015, probably. And I would say in the last 10 years, everything good that has happened in my life has come from Twitter. I've gotten jobs through Twitter. I've gotten clients through Twitter. I've made friends through Twitter. Just so many great things have come out of it for me. And I know that it's kind of fashionable to hate on it. If you spend much time on Twitter, which I don't call X because X is a bad name. If you spend much time there, you will see a very interesting phenomenon, which is the heavy Twitter user who also spends a lot of time complaining about how bad Twitter is. I don't do that, right? And I think a lot of it is that I don't have a lot of junk on my timeline because over the years I have taken a lot of care to curate it. And you see a lot of people on Twitter complaining about content on their timeline as if they didn't invent their timeline, as if they didn't follow all of those people, and as if the timeline is not a reflection of what they are really interested in. And so I just have spent a lot of time curating that timeline and cultivating relationships with people that have really just made it a fantastic boon to my life in a lot of different areas. And I think it's probably because whatever its shortcomings might be, Twitter is a fantastic place for meeting like-minded people who share some of your ideas, some of your values, some of your interests. And in that way, it brings together people who can synergize in ways that I don't think you can do that with any other social media platform that I'm aware of. I'm certainly not going to do it on Facebook. You're not going to do it on Instagram or whatever. I think Twitter is unique in that way. I also think it's unique in that it is a writer's platform. It's of course people post videos and text, etc., but it's fundamentally a writer's platform. And that's why I think there's probably a lot of rivalry now between Twitter and Substack, because Substack obviously moving into that sort of text-based social media space, and so Twitter's trying to punish that and keep that from happening, or whatever, which is there as a business decision for them, I'm sure. But overall, to answer your question, it's been fantastic for me.
What do you think it was back in, what did you say, 2015 that got you more engaged with it? What changed, or what drew you to it?
At that point, I just knew a lot of people personally who were using it, most of whom have dropped off, right? And I thought, well, it'd be interesting to take another look at that. And I just started to follow some people. And at first I think I follow like a lot of commentators and a lot of news sources. And I thought, oh, it's essentially like a news ticker, like a stock ticker or something that you, from the 20s, these machines used to spit out long pieces of paper with stock date on them. And then I started to really see more and more how it could be used, and more what it was, and started to kind of find myself in a community. Now, Twitter's obviously very different now than it was in 2015, 2016, where I felt like at that point it was just a lot easier to kind of build a community there, and I felt like I was more part of a group at that point than probably I have since. But that's some of that's me too. So in terms of what drew me to it, I think a lot of it was just the people I started to meet.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, because I use Twitter in a similar way, where even now for me, that's where I get most of my news. And most of it is just kind of reading headlines in the news section. But also, yeah, I don't see a lot of craziness in my feed at all, because I don't follow a lot of people. And then the things that I do engage with they're similar to the kind of things I talk about on this podcast. It's psychology, it's quotes from writers, But I would agree that the reason that it's, in the end, like, Twitter is the only social media that I really use. I have a Facebook, but I literally don't have any friends. I don't do anything on there. I use it for like marketplace, kind of like a Craigslist.
Right.
But I tried Instagram for a really long time, and Instagram just it just turned out to be so unappealing to me. The kind of the visual, kind of, you're looking at videos, you're looking at images, where, yeah, as a writer, I think I was also drawn to Twitter because, I saw, people are engaging in ideas here. And the interesting thing about Twitter is I'm sure there's a lot of bots, there's a lot of trolls out there, there's a lot of negativity, but I've seen so many people on Twitter come against an argument. Like, somebody will post an argument, they will respond to it in opposition. And then after a couple of tweets of going back and forth, the two people will say, "Oh, I see where you're coming from." And that's something I really, you just don't see it on other platforms because of the format maybe of the posts and the interactions.
Okay, Instagram strikes me as being basically television, right? It's essentially this medium that is highly visual and that renders you more or less a passive consumer. Now, I know you can make comments and message people and that kind of thing on there, but the shape of the technology seems to me to kind of push you toward being an audience member in the way that Twitter does not push you toward a kind of passive audience member position. And obviously there are people who use Twitter just to read, but it's designed for you to engage in a way that Instagram does not seem to me to be. Now, I'm not a heavy Instagram user, so maybe I'm wrong, but that's my impression.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Twitter, it's not like an actual conversation. It doesn't feel like a conversation, but it does feel like it feels like almost like there's a battle going on between ideas, not in a negative way, but it's a place where people can hash out ideas in a way that others don't. Do you have, as far as Twitter and being engaged with it, using it to find people to work with, using it for job opportunities, do you have a specific strategy? Do you have like this posting schedule that you try to keep to? Or are you trying to put up content to draw people? Or are you just kind of using it whenever you feel inspired and kind of passively?
I have tried over the years to have a posting schedule, and I've not been able to stick with it. I mean, I can see the advantage of that, but honestly too, when I do that, I feel like my content becomes drier and less immediate. And so I use Twitter best when I just use it essentially as a personal notebook, and I have a thought and I put it down. And I just find it's best for me if I just use it sort of spontaneously but frequently. It just comes to mind. I probably a year ago I wrote a tweet that went viral, lots and lots and lots of views. And I can't even remember what I said, but I remember I said it standing in line to speak to someone behind a window at the hospital. And I just had a thought. I pulled my phone out and I wrote it. And I feel like that's the best way for me, really. So no, I don't have a hard schedule or whatever. I like to use it spontaneously and freely. And I think too, it's helpful for me because I'm not very caught up in it. There are people who are just very responsive to Twitter drama and who like to keep track of who is friends with whom, and who has an alliance with whom. And I don't do any of that, really. I have people I like and I know, and if I want to know them better, I invite them on the podcast, and I feel like that gives me quite a bit of freedom from the negative parts too. Is just that I'm not. While I love Twitter, it is not my friend group, and we are not in high school, right? And so I'm not trying to monitor, what's the relationship between this person and that person. But I know that lots of people kind of approach it that way. And it seems to me that is a perfect recipe for just burning yourself out immediately and ending up disgusted by people. And so I think it's useful to me, it's useful to run it as two things, essentially a notebook where I type out spontaneous thoughts, and two, almost a Rolodex where I have contacts with lots of interesting people that I like, and I can reach out to them anytime there if I, have an idea or need something or whatever. And so beyond that, to just keep my focus elsewhere.
I think I really relate with that. For me, anytime I try to be active where I'm like, okay, I need to post so many times a day so that I get caught up in, I don't honestly know how the algorithm works. And part of it is not wanting to learn. Like that's not where I want to spend my time, is trying to figure out algorithms, because
Right.
Similar to what you're saying, if you're focused on the algorithm or some schedule rather than just being inspired to like say things that come to you in a moment where you're actually contemplating something, it just starts to feel very dry. It starts to feel very almost burdensome. I think burnout is the right word. You can come to feel like, well, what am I doing this for? Especially if the results aren't anything that you would hope for, I guess. Mm-hmm. But and sometimes social media to me can feel so transactional. I go on there and yes, the feed that I have, I'm interested in a lot of those topics, but to read, here I read about men's health, and then here I read about Jungian psychology, and here the hero's journey, and just so quickly in these little short bursts that it feels very, it can feel shallow, I guess, in a way where I really want to be able to, I want to spend my time going deeper. And so I think my biggest challenge with Twitter, I would say, is that I don't want to give it too much attention. I don't want it to distract me too much. But similar to what you're saying, I actually have found a lot of interesting people through Twitter. And especially since starting a podcast, if I reach out to them, I end up having a conversation, and conversations like this end up feeling much more fulfilled than, sitting there and reading through people's posts.
Sure.
but it really does feel like for me at least, it feels like the way that people talk about the internet as, it was going to create this one place, but really what it did was it segmented everybody into kind of their own little tribal interests. And I never really had used social media as a way to find my people, or like people that I could engage with in a way.
Right.
Until I started a podcast, and then Twitter became extremely useful for that, because there are people out there just throwing ideas out, whatever books they've read and the ideas that they've synthesized. And I just find that fascinating to be able to connect with people that way.
But I find it useful to think about, to remember two things about Twitter. One is that the accounts you see on Twitter are people, right? So those are just like, they're people. And it's easy to think that they are content creating machines or something. But when you are on Twitter, you're interacting with people. And I think that's easy to forget. And second, I think it's good to just think of tweets as essentially being almost like a calling card. They're just a little piece of information that gives you something from this person. And so it's a way of making a connection and offering you an opportunity to enlarge that connection should you want to. Right? So I find that both of those good things to remember as rules of thumb.
Yeah, I think that's wise. Outside of Twitter, the things that you do external from Twitter, your writing, your podcast, the kind of work you do with people around relationships, or anything like that. I'm curious, well, first of all, how would you sum that up? Like, what is your workout? Like, what is the thing that you're trying to do? What are you trying to bring to the world?
Well, that's an interesting question. And if you know the answer, maybe you could tell me. I'm still in the process of figuring that out. I think, so let me tell you what I actually do. And then maybe I don't know if from there I could figure out what I'm trying.
Yeah, maybe there's a job title, but really what we're trying to get to is more of like the meaning, like the soul search. Yeah.
Yeah, I think honestly, I am just trying to be helpful to people. So I started my coaching practice 5 years ago, probably. And I did it, well, for two reasons. One, I'd always been interested in that kind of work, personal development, spirituality, psychology, that kind of thing, and always wanted to be helpful to people in that space. But what was happening as I was writing a lot about those kinds of issues on Twitter, and I was getting lots and lots of DMs asking for help. And so I thought so I actually started, once I kind of discovered Zoom, I started out, there would be times when I would have an evening free and I would just tweet, I'm giving out a free coaching session tonight if you want to meet. And there were people, when I wasn't even charging, I'd have a coaching session with someone for an hour, and it was just a great thing because I would get to know people all over the world, and people would trust me with really difficult problems they were wrestling with. And so as I started to do that and I saw that people would respond, I kind of developed it into something more formal. And over the years, I've met with, probably a couple hundred people at least to talk about all sorts of issues. But I would say I'd probably say 60 to 70% of the people who come to me are men. And sometimes they come because they just are stuck and they have like a general sense of confusion, and they don't quite know what they're doing. But most often they come because they're having trouble relating to a woman. And often, and then the other part I have, the other 30%, the women who often are having some kind of problem with a man, or it's very interesting. I would say women a lot of the women I've spoken to in that capacity kind of deal with family issues that they want to talk about their, how things are with their mom or their stepmom or and a lot of that is turns out to be people who are kind of enmeshed with those relationships and need help sorting through where to set a boundary and what's okay with them and what's not. And so I think what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to sort of find my own way to maximize my ability, honestly, to just lift people up from wherever they are to wherever I can lift them. And I know that sounds probably amorphous, but in terms of the big picture, that's what I'm trying to do, I think.
Yeah. Do you have is there like a particular starting point, or do you have like a model that when people come to you with their problems, you try to help them step out of kind of the situation they're in and then look at it? What's that kind of framework that you approach it from?
I don't have like a long-term coaching package even, right? Like I don't have like, sometimes you'll see a coach who says, pay me $1,500, we'll work together for 3 months and we'll see which is fine. I mean, that's great. I'm not opposed to that, but I just don't do that. And so when I'm working with someone, I never know if I'll see them again. And so I'm always very focused on usually about the first third to quarter of our time together is me directing kind of an exploration because I'm just trying to gather information. And even there, a lot of people I've found need help sorting through what are details and what is the core of the problem. So sometimes I have to be, because I'm mindful of our time, I have to be a little bit directive in sort of helping people see what the core of their issues are. And then when we get there, I think the next thing I do, I would call just sort of almost like an empowerment phase where I'm asking a lot of questions at that point, trying to help the person to make a shift to where they can see their situation from a more empowered place. So it's not uncommon at all for me to ask the question, what would you do in this situation if you believed X? Or what would happen if you went to that person and just told them the truth? How would they respond? And so a lot of that sort of middle part is my trying to recast or at least offer them options for how they think about the situation. And then too, there's also a part where people I've noticed need sort of different levels of empathetic connection. Some people come and they're just very focused on what's the solution to my problem. And some people come and they just really need a to feel that someone is listening and feel that connection. And so it's always interesting because in those sessions, part of the job of the coach or the counselor or whatever you're kind of professional you're dealing with is to make moment by moment decisions about what this person is asking for without actually asking for it. And it's also not unusual that someone will come to me literally because they just want to talk for an hour because they have this issue and they just want someone to attend to them who they think could understand. And so if that's the case, when I kind of sense that, I will probably extend that first part of the session where I'm just listening. I'll extend that a little longer. And so it could go that way too. And then finally, I always try to wrap the session up with with kind of a so what? Like what would be if you wanted to take the next step toward growing in this way, what would that look like? And so I kind of use that as a general framework, where at least for the first session. Now I have clients who come back to me many times, and I have people I've worked with for more than a year, from over that course of time, who are essentially asking me to kind of encourage and monitor their growth over a longer period, which I love doing that. But especially if I am trying to make some significant change for someone in a single hour, I tend to try to follow that framework fairly closely. Because in an hour, we're not going to be able to explore all the reasons why you got into this situation, right? We have to be focused on how you should respond, how to break this pattern. And that's and so that I'm not in a position where I'm doing therapy with people as much as I am in these single sessions, really helping people to rearrange their thinking about whatever specific problem they've brought.
Yeah, absolutely. In the language that I use, I'm not any kind of coach or anything, but I guess just in working on myself, there was a period where I went through, it was like early in my 30s. I had just stepped away from the religion of my upbringing, and I went to therapy to just figure some things out. And what you're talking about as far as just needing somebody to listen and to kind of just hear you, that was very important for me. And it was actually in that form of therapy, I don't know if I got much farther than just having somebody just listen to me, because I sat there and I was just like this. I think growing up, I was just this very, I don't know if I want to say intelligent, but I was this very thoughtful kid, very, like highly sensitive, thoughtful kid who was just constantly thinking about everything. And I came from this world where there was nobody who was going to like listen to me say that. So I can see the value in that. But also in the way that you're talking about helping people reframe their understanding of the situation. I think maybe the vocabulary I use when I, talk about it with people is I just talk about stories. I think that stories is essentially the way that the human psyche works. It's like the software that we run on is stories. And what so often happens is that people get caught up in these stories that, they it's not their fault. Like it's literally how humans operate. And we get them when we're young, and we get them from the environments we come in or that we come from. And at some point we realize that the story that we've been running on isn't helpful anymore. It's not benefiting us, or maybe it's just not even true the way that we expected it to be true. Maybe perhaps we literalized the story. And there was a point for me where I started to read a lot of Joseph Campbell, a lot of Carl Jung, and I was getting to the point where I was seeing how everything was story-based. And so the last probably 3 or 4 sessions that I ever had with a therapist, I was just going in there and saying, oh, I saw this movie, and I'm just like analyzing the movie to the therapist just because I needed somebody to be able to listen to me talk about stories. Mm-hmm. And I think for a lot of people in their regular life, this was the case for me. There's just not these things that are going on in our minds, these things that we're constantly working over, even if they're our own problems. A lot of the times you go to try to talk to people in your real life, your friends, your family, your peer group, siblings, whoever it may be, and they're operating on the same story that you're trying to escape. And so they don't necessarily have the ability to listen, because you explaining to them the issue is actually making them uncomfortable.
Right.
And then also they don't have the vocabulary to analyze it or to kind of respond in a way that's helpful. And so you end up just hearing these phrases, these rote phrases back to you that are, they can make you feel very unheard. Like, oh, sure. I feel like I'm watching a like a Hallmark video or like a Hallmark movie or something. So I can definitely relate with that. And coming out of that story, and then the empowerment that you actually feel is you get to go, oh, I have the power to write my own story. And I think, deep down inside, the story that we really want to play out is already written inside of us in some way. And really, we just need to find it.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the way I approach these things too, is, well, two things. I don't often talk about sort of the kind of inward narrative or the self narrative that you're giving yourself to a client, because that doesn't necessarily serve my clients at the moment. But I would say that most of us, and certainly the people I see, are living out a narrative where they do not quite understand. Well, their narrative is, things happen to me that are totally unrelated to my own choices and behaviors. And especially if you have people who have had a very difficult past, or they've, had some kind of chronic trauma or whatever, they've really developed over time a set of behaviors that may have at least helped them to feel safer at that moment. But as life goes on, become they become a real burden, because they undermine the process of these people actually getting what they want. And so the obvious example is kind of the low boundary person who, in his or her youth, lived with someone who was dangerous in some way, and so kind of learn to accommodate, not to push back, to disappear, make themselves small, try not to be noticed. But later in life, that is not a successful strategy for, getting the things that you want, especially in situations where you need to assert yourself. But the story that comes along with that is something like, if I am unnoticed, I will be safe. So when I'm working with people, a lot of my focus isn't at that theoretical level of sort of what is the narrative you're telling yourself, but I am asking them to almost reimagine their own situation within a framework that stems from a different foundational belief. So like I said, I might say, well, how do you think you would see this situation if you felt like it was safe to speak up? What would you say if you thought it was safe to speak up? And I feel like that's a way of almost challenging that inner narrative without mentioning it, because I'm asking that person to step out of the narrative he or she has brought to this moment and to step into another narrative. And I think I like doing it that way because it's not me pushing anything. It's just inviting that person into try on a different story for a moment. And I also, what you're saying, I'm a big believer that, yes, they're deep inside of us. We all know what's in alignment for us. We all know what's kind of the right path for us at some deep level. And that for most people, that intuition, that sense of connection to themselves, to their own inner guidance system, really becomes severed by things that happened to them that should not have happened, or things that did not happen that should have happened. This experience does that. And so I do see, like, part of my role, even on Twitter, when I write on Twitter, I do see part of my role as trying to shepherd people back to a connection with themselves where they slowly can start to live more in alignment with what that inner guidance system is telling them. And I really think that inner guidance system is so critical for a fulfilled life, and that so much of our frustration and even our sort of anxiety and depression come from having that connection severed. And so part of, I think, when you talk about asking people to try on a different story, that's sort of an indirect way of trying to kind of break up the ice that has frozen them into a story that keeps them disconnected from that part of themselves that would guide them to do otherwise.
Yeah, I could see how you don't want to approach it directly, because in a way, yeah, maybe it's just not as helpful. I think about the way that we connect to stories anyways, the way we connect to myth. And in our own personal lives, we see kind of our stories gradually change and shift. But I think just over time, the human entity, whatever we are as a species, our story has just gradually shifted here and there. But when you see somebody try to actively change the story, when you see somebody try to to be coercive about saying, hey, no, this is the new story, there's always bound to be a lot of pushback against it. It
Sure.
seems that the story has to unfold in a more natural way. It has to almost unfold in an unconscious way. I think for me, as far as politics, I don't really side with either the right or the left. I think they're just mirrors of each other in a lot of ways. But I think we've seen that over the last 4 or 5 years. What's really come out is kind of people waking up to this idea that, particularly on the left, there was like this narrative that's been tried to be forced rather than kind of. I think when the story changes, you have to feel it in an unconscious way. You kind of have to let it evolve or emerge naturally. And so it makes a lot of sense what you're saying when, if you were to come in and say, okay, all these things you're saying is a story. I'm just going to put it out there. This is a story that you're telling yourself. Now here's, I'm going to give you a new story. It's not going to resonate with people. They're going to think about it too consciously, and it's not going to, stir up the emotions that need to come along with it.
Yes, and also people want to have their autonomy respected. And so if I would never say, here's the story you're in, and here's the story you should be in. I mean, who am I?
Yeah, well, the word should is already a red flag.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think, like I said, it's really about inviting people to just try on a different perspective and to invoke their imaginations in a way, because in another way, a lot of us run into problems because our imaginations are atrophied, and we really can't imagine ourselves in a different story. We really can't imagine ourselves speaking up when our whole life strategy has been to be quiet. And so if someone's going to pay me for a coaching session, at the very least, I think what I can do for that person is to try to sort of kickstart their imagination in that way. And those questions are a way of doing it. And the other thing you brought up that I think is really important is, I think and maybe especially in our culture, we have this story of how change happens. And the way that change happens in the story is we visualize a goal. We set a bunch of objectives, which we then crunch down to a to-do list. And from that, then we just execute the to-do list and we get the goal. And that might work if you are, I don't know, trying to create an industrial product or something, but that's not really the way people grow and change. And so I think it's just so important to kind of give people permission to think, well, what if I were a different kind of person? And if I were a person who was sort of more in alignment with my own values and goals. What would I do with this 40 minutes I have free? Right? And to just allow people to sort of feel into that kind of change that they're trying to make in the gentlest possible way. And I just think it's so important to sort of hold, when you're thinking about personal growth and helping people to grow, it's so important to just make sure your own mindset is one that's full of organic metaphors, and that you see people as plants and not as machines. And again, going back to Twitter, a lot of the self-help advice you see on Twitter has that kind of machine orientation. Do X, Y, and Z, you'll get A, B, and C results. But and again, that's I'm sure that's useful for some things, but when you're really trying to grow from the core of your soul, I just find that does not work very often because people undermine themselves. And it's very helpful to take a kind of gentle, organic approach so that it doesn't kick in your defense mechanisms and cause you to undermine yourself, which is most of us are probably just waiting often for a chance to undermine ourselves, to keep ourselves from getting to that goal, because getting to a goal and living in alignment with those goals and your values, et cetera, is often scary. And that's why people undermine their own journey to doing that. But it's also the path to fulfillment.
Yeah, it's a scary, you've got to step outside of everybody else's story, or like you got to step off the known road and you have to go out into the wilderness in a way. Very scary.
And you have to step out of the stories and practices that you have adapted, that you've taught yourself will keep you safe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very scary. Psychologically, it's akin to death. But I think I really like story and myth and the kind of the symbology of it. So when you talk about, getting connected with that inner voice, or that inner, I think you said inner
guidance system. Yeah.
Yeah. The inner guidance system. Or, if you had, say, if you asked that question, if you had 40 minutes free, how would you really want to spend it? And then you also talk about restoking people's imagination. These are all in a sense, these are all ways of becoming childlike again. Like, and when Jesus said, become as a little child, I think this is partly what he meant, is when you go through this process of realizing that you are actually the one causing all of your issues, you're the one that's locked yourself in these patterns because you're not recognizing them, then it's upon you or us as adults, or, it's upon me in my life to break the pattern by stepping outside of the story, by finding a new story, a better, more helpful story. And by so doing, like, psychologically, it really is as scary as dying. You really do go through this period of fear and turmoil and pain. But then when it's over, like you were saying, it's so much more fulfilling. And you really do, you kind of come back to this place of living as a child where you're just not so caught up in all the worries. You don't have the same anxieties and the same, maybe issues that you had before. But another thing that I really like to think about is, in this process, is use the word gentle when you're dealing with the people you work with. Just teaching myself to be gentle was so valuable because I could really beat myself up, and I could just really, any mistake I made, I could be very negative. Right. But learning to be gentle with myself, not only moving forward, but in looking back, because these patterns that we have today that we feel like are holding us back, they're there because at some point in our life we needed them. And so when you talk about somebody being small or not wanting to be heard, sure, that's not a successful strategy going forward, but there's a part of that gentleness is being really grateful for that part of ourselves in the past, because it helped us get to where we are. It helped us
Right.
survive that potentially dangerous situation.
Absolutely. Yes, I think too that, like, if you want to talk about childlikeness, the thing that comes to my mind is openness, and that we are able to sort of simply be more open to the world, and in some and in a way to the spirit. Let's say that, right, and that we're more able to be open to those things, and we're more able to inhabit our own experience when we aren't sort of locked in all of that armor. And the the experience you're referring to as a kind of death is also a kind of birth. And if I think people who are willing to undergo it find that it's so much more freeing to have a full palette of means for responding to reality that you didn't have when you were locked in your habitual unconscious patterns of response. So I think for me, that's an important concept. Moving from essentially having these responses to reality that are maybe 2 or 3 colors that were safe for you to color with, to now being able to respond with multiple colors, multiple shades, different hues, different tone. Your like I said, your palette for response is so much broader that you can paint a whole different picture or tell a whole different story in a way that you couldn't when you were really locked in to your own defensive patterns.
Yeah, that's a really good metaphor. It's your world can become so much more colorful, so much brighter, so much more rich, have so much more depth. Yeah,
Yes,
I think that's great.
true.
Yeah. What about so part of, at least online, part of your I don't know what you put out there is you also talk about pastoral counseling, and I'm curious about that side of things for you, from like maybe from a faith centered perspective, or how does that factor in, and what does that mean to you?
Well, it's obviously I'm not a pastor. I don't have a church. I'm an ordained chaplain and pastoral counselor too. And so I sort of take that to mean that I have training and experience to sort of help people who come to me who want to talk about spiritual issues, which does happen from time to time, in part because of how I present myself on social media, I think. And that is actually often quite complicated for people. It sounds like you may know that, right? And sort of helping people to integrate spiritual values, religious values into their identity and into their palette of response. Because many people have experienced religion as something external to themselves, and not necessarily as a larger story that they inhabit, right? So and it's hard for people to understand how they could, say, draw a hard boundary with an abusive relative and still be a good person, because they've kind of come up in a religious culture that valorizes what it thinks of as selflessness. That's just, and so how would they integrate that? And one of the very interesting things that's happened to me over the years is that I have clients who have some level of spirituality, or who have some level of interest in spirituality, but who have come to me from all kinds of religions, which I wouldn't be able to do if I couldn't pull from a global pool. So I've had Hindu clients, I've had Muslim clients, I've had Jewish clients, I've had clients who sort of think of themselves as nuns, right? Who think of themselves as just sort of secular, a-religious people. And then I have people who are Catholic and evangelical, and the process of growth for all of those people is in terms of its form is very, very similar. But it's been instructive and educational for me to sort of work with all of those people. And now sometimes it's very just something I have to have an extra level of sensitivity to, because if you're talking to a young Indian guy who's Hindu and who's living in India, and he wants to talk about his parents are pressuring him to marry this girl. Well, I literally know nothing about Indian culture, almost nothing, right? And so I have found that sometimes I just have to say to people, here's how it seems to me. You tell me how this would work in your situation. So, but anyway, to get back to your question about pastoral counseling, I essentially sort of see it as giving my coaching. I try to make a distinction between kind of my sort of pure coaching and something like pastoral counseling, which I think of as really being focused more on people who want to integrate some religious or spiritual perspective into their current life situation and have not found a good or easy way to do that. So that's kind of that. That's a distinction. There's a distinction between that and kind of more mainstream coaching, where people have where that level of perspective is not as relevant to the client at the moment.
Yeah, I could see how it would be a sensitive topic, or like you'd have to figure out a way to walk that path gently, because not only are you dealing with the person's kind of personal story, personal journey, but also there's this external system perhaps that they're trying to navigate as well.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, sometimes what the people are coming to me for is almost in those situations a sort of permission to step outside of the most restrictive expressions of their faith tradition, and to find a way to integrate a little bit more freedom and a little bit more just liberty to live. And I think also probably to look at and answer deeper questions than their sort of organizational and subcultural experience can answer for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming from my background, I grew up LDS or Mormon, and so I was like very, very concrete, like literal version of religion, and so that's how I.
Would you use the word restrictive?
Oh yeah, very restrictive. Yeah,
okay.
Quite restrictive. Yeah, everything was. You could compare it to a bunch of different religions, but in a sense, Mormonism is taken so literally that every day seems to be like an actual struggle for trying to try to like reach some outcome. And it was very interesting for me to eventually be able to step out of that system. And now that I look back on it, the thing that I can see, the way you talked about working with people from all sorts of different backgrounds, the way I see religion now is it's kind of a solidifying of a certain story or myth. And I think that at its origin, I think that every religion, every spiritual practice, every kind of idea that these ideologies that people get wrapped into, I think at some core, at some starting point, they were all kind of an artistic venture, like this artistic expression. And in a way, I think every type of myth, if you sit there and analyze it enough or look at it from the right angle, it actually could point you towards a greater version of consciousness. But we end up literalizing these stories in such a way that when people can't figure out how to integrate them into like their own actual experience, it really burdens, it can really burden that process of becoming conscious.
Mhm.
But being able to step back and kind of see the stories with their various characters as archetypes, as processes that may very well be going on inside of us, inside of our own psyche, to see the symbols for something that could be much more representative of you and your process. It seems that almost any faith practice, any religion could in the end be geared towards some level of greater consciousness, or just healing, or just, becoming more aware.
Yes, I think I am. I was just actually thinking about this week because someone asked me about it. I'm going to not go sort of the whole hog in terms of the Union route on things, because I do believe that there are there are spiritual realities that are not simply expressions of our own internal processes, right? And because in the end, in a way, if you take that to its extreme, you end up becoming a kind of naturalist, right? Where all references to spiritual realities can be boiled down to sort of natural phenomena of what's happening inside the individual. So I wouldn't go to that extreme. I do think at the same time that the human being often is a being that longs for a level of certainty that is impossible for us to achieve in this life. And so ends up, and maybe this is your experience in the LDS church, is that we end up sort of creating almost like a subcultural system to prevent us from encountering any kind of shadow or um, any kind of complexity that requires the cultivation of a connection with oneself, with one's inner guidance system, and um, short circuits the need to develop actual lived wisdom. For when there isn't a rule, what do I do? And so, in an odd way, those kinds of very restrictive, sort of rules-oriented, certainty-bound religious systems actually end up preventing people not just from knowing themselves, but ironically preventing them from knowing God.
Yeah, I think you said it well, because you did tap it a little bit into the Jungian there when you said it prevents them from seeing their own shadow or looking at their own shadow. And I think that in itself is how it prevents them from actually gaining a relationship with God, because they become so, the religions can't, like the religion I came from, speaking from my own experience, it was so restrictive that anything outside the bounds of that belief system, you just didn't want to look at it, because you really do want to know with certainty things that you can't know in this life. And if you step outside of that story, myth, belief system, whatever it is, and you actually do take a chance at looking at your shadow, it can crumble pretty quickly, because there's too much in reality that contradicts the version of the version that you're trying to present to yourself.
And I would think too that I'm sorry, I've totally lost my train of thought. So pick up with what you were saying. The this is what I wanted to say. That we end up sort of substituting our place in a subcultural system, a subcultural religious system. It's not just LDS. I've known people in, more traditionally evangelical subcultures who've had very similar experiences. So what happens is that you end up trying to substitute the unwritten rules of your subculture for your own internal guidance system. And so that you become severed from yourself and almost severed from actually fully being able to be a person in a way, because it probably, I would think, recruits you for a kind of self-repression, because especially when all of your relationships are bound up in that context,
Yeah, absolutely. I think about it. I think about it similar to the way that perhaps the Soviet Union was described. If you read, like the Gulag Archipelago, um, it's like an authoritarian structure with some authority at the very top, and it becomes so restrictive from an authoritarian perspective that there's an authoritarian at the top, and then there's this chain of authority, and then when it gets down to you, you have your parents and you have your friends and you have, your peers around you. They're all behaving like authorities towards you as well, to the point where inside your own psyche, this little authoritarian figure sits inside there and doesn't even let you think the thoughts that you would naturally think.
Right.
And so, it can become, it becomes very oppressive in that way.
And you see, I think there too, the question of, are our metaphors organic or industrial, make a big difference, because what you're describing is a metaphor for spiritual growth that is fundamentally industrial, right? Like the word has come down from the CEO that you must not wear short sleeves on whatever day.
Yeah.
It is,
well,
right?
Hey, you know a little bit about Mormons, huh?
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's an industrial, it operates on an industrial scheme as opposed to an organic scheme where you as a young person might be shepherded through your own process of growth within a religious context, in order to sort of grow into the fulfillment of what you are supposed to be.
Yeah. And I think that that's a much healthier way to approach things. It really does. I like your analogy of, or metaphor that we should be treated much more like plants than machines. Even when you spoke about coaches who want to charge $1,500 up front to go through my program, that's the response I have, is like, it's just a little too machine-like. It's a little too structured.
Yeah, I think the way you avoid that as a coach is you make it real clear what they're getting. So if you want to pay me, I do have a setup where people can pay for like 10 sessions at a time at a discount. But what I don't do is I can't promise results because you're not a machine. And reality is not a machine. So what we can do in that time is we could lean toward the sun. We turn toward the light. And I can help you do that. And I can help you stay on track with that. I can help work through what the roadblocks are. I can help talk about why you might want to undermine yourself. But I cannot guarantee a result, right? And that's part of the thing too. Like when you see a lot of the self-help stuff on Twitter, this is what I was saying, is that so much of it is about promising you results. Buy my program and you will lose 100 pounds in 28 hours or whatever the promise of results is. And that's probably why you have a sense of repulsion, because it's people promising results about things they can't possibly promise results about.
Yeah. And deep down, those results, whatever it may be, like, you're going to lose weight, you're going to have more friends, you're going to have more money. In a way, those are all pretty shallow goals anyways. I always think about them as proximal goals, meaning like your psyche might keep talking to you about how it wants that, it wants that, it wants that. But really, it's just using that to get you to another level, to get you on a path of any kind of growth and any kind of maturation, to get you to that point where you can readjust your story.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's true.
Yeah.
Very much.
Well, Dean, looks like we're at an hour.
Yes.
And it flew by. It was actually very interesting. I appreciate your perspective on things and like your approach. You have this very calm, kind of clear way of explaining things, which also is one of the reasons I was drawn to your podcast.
Well, it helps. It helps
Yeah.
if you can speak clearly and know what you are trying to say to people. So thank you very much for having me on. I enjoyed it. Maybe we could do it again sometime.
Yeah, that would be great. If people wanted to find you, just where would they go looking on, I guess,
The
on
simplest
Twitter?
place is on Twitter, Dean Abbott on Twitter, or just deanabbott.com. I also am working with an organization, a coaching organization called A Life Designed, and you can find out what I'm offering through there at alifedesign.org.
Okay, awesome.
Okay.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much.
Thanks. All
Bye.
right.